Hey there, friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind, a podcast for highly sensitive people really trying to figure out how to navigate things in a world that can feel an awful lot too loud and too bright and too overwhelming at times. I am a highly sensitive person, a counsellor, and a mindful movement coach, and I am really thrilled to be able to share some of my own personal experiences with you, as well as have conversations with other people, with you, around what it is to be sensitive in the world and to navigate that with self-compassion and kindness. So welcome. If you are new around here, it is lovely to have you. If you are listening back after the break that was January, welcome back. I mean, it's really me that's coming back, but thank you for your patience is probably more accurate. I did take pretty much all of January off from podcasting. I was still doing my other work, but the podcast just got put on pause for a little bit there. And it's funny, I had quite a few false starts coming back. I have actually recorded some episodes that I don't think I will ever release, not because there was anything wrong with them, but I wasn't really thrilled with how I felt as I was showing up. And so we are starting again today. And what I thought I would share with you today is actually a story about something that happened to me in the past. And it's kind of a fairly general story about when I used to work in the corporate world and how I would do things differently today if that is where I was now. Because as a young, highly sensitive person, I was incredibly dysregulated. And I think that this story can be really helpful whether you also work in an environment like that you find overwhelming and overstimulating, or even if you don't. So if you are like, I don't work in an environment like that, still stay tuned, because the general kind of sense of what I'm trying to share in this episode is beyond the confines of the corporate world and certainly goes beyond even just the idea of career. It's really about how do we scaffold our sensitivity so that instead of seeing it as a liability, we can see it as something that needs to be nurtured, needs to be loved, needs to be met with compassion, so that we can access the superpowers that sit behind that and not always feel kind of pulled around, tugged around, pushed around by the feelings of overwhelm that our sensitivity can bring up. So let's go back quite a number of years. I finished university and got my first real, quote unquote, real job. And I was working in an office for the first time in the middle of Melbourne's CBD, Central Business District, right down on Collins Street, Little Collins Street actually. So a very, very busy part of town. My day started by getting in the car and driving to the train station. I had to get there early enough that I would get a car park, because notoriously, where I live, which is quite a way out of the city, it's very difficult to get a car park after a certain time. So I would get up early, I would get on the train, I would sit in a very crowded train. Sometimes I would stand, because even though I was getting on at like the third stop from the end of the start of the route, it would still sometimes be full. So sometimes I would be standing. I would take the long journey into the city, which would sometimes take up to an hour. Then I would walk along the crowded streets of Melbourne to get to my office building, where I would sit in an environment that was often too cold and too bright and do my job. Now, I worked in 3 different corporate jobs over a period of about 5 years. And they all had their own unique environments, but what was consistent among them was the bright lights, the competing noises from other people on phone calls, from clients, from all the things that happen in an office building, and all the overwhelming stuff that happened before I even stepped foot in the office. Oh, and one other thing, interpersonal conflict. So what I ended up like after 5 years in that environment was a bit of a mess, because even though I knew I was a sensitive person, I might not have had the language around high sensitivity at that point, I don't think. I knew I was a sensitive person, but I very much made that a problem about me rather than something that was to be nurtured or, loved or compassionate towards, I very much made it feel like it, or it felt like to me, that it was a burden, that it was something that I wasn't doing enough to like get over. And I was consequently very overwhelmed and actually quite unwell. And what I see now, looking back, as still a very sensitive person, but one who has a lot more awareness, a lot more knowledge, and a lot more skills to navigate that, I see someone who was stepping into an office environment that already was going to be a little bit sensory overwhelming and emotionally overwhelming, which we'll get to in a minute. But I was stepping into that space already with a nervous system that had been really tested on the journey there. Because what we know about being highly sensitive is that, do you remember those old telephone exchange services? Now, these predate me, but we've seen videos of them, right? Where there's like the switchboards, they had to plug the different wires in to send the different phone calls from different places. If we were taking a phone call, only want to be plugged into one channel, right? So that we can listen to that one thing. I think of being highly sensitive as being like plugged into multiple channels at the same time and trying to filter and process and understand everything that's coming in all at once. That's very much what it can feel like, because there isn't always such an ability to sort of like tune out all the other channels. So we have the bright lights, we have the noise, we have the inner sensations, we have all the things. And so immediately, as soon as you're taking public transport, immediately, as soon as you are rushing and on a bit of a deadline, immediately, as soon as you are crowded in with other people, there is the potential that in and of itself is setting the baseline of your nervous system activation for the day quite high, unless you have ways of scaffolding your nervous system and scaffolding your sensitivity. So what I see now, like I said, in the rearview mirror, which is always so much clearer, is that I, instead of scaffolding my sensitivity, was really bombarding it without any ability or any awareness around how to buffer all of the inputs, because there were a lot of inputs. There was nothing that I was doing that helped me to create some scaffolding, some, just like cushioning around that reality. And then I go into the office space where, again, there's people on phones, there's phones ringing, there's people moving around all the time. There are, a million and one things happening in an office at any given time. And then I would also find that there was interpersonal conflict. This person doesn't like that person, and that person's trying to take that person's job, and this person doesn't work hard enough, and that person doesn't do this. And, there's just all this stuff to pick up on. Oh my gosh, it was no wonder, looking back now, that I found that to be an environment that I couldn't cope in. However, what I realize, again, in, hindsight, was that when I left that environment, what I was really running from was my own dysregulation. And that makes me a little bit sad, because there is so much that we can do to scaffold that. Now, I'm not sad that I left the corporate environment. I'm really pleased with, where I've gone, but I'm sad that I made myself feel like I was broken, I was a problem, and I just kind of had to get my shit together, right? That was very much my inner dialogue. I had to figure it out. I had to get it together. And whilst that's true in the sense that we have to be self-responsible. Usually there's no, person riding in on a horseback to save us from ourselves. There is also the reality that we can't get where we want to go by punishing ourselves and being cruel and being unkind. It doesn't work. And I can promise you that because I've tried. I have tried. I don't know that I knew that I was consciously doing that, but I can see it so clearly when I look back. So what would I do differently? And what do I do differently? I think that's two kind of important questions. And the answer is that I would respect my sensitivity and I would scaffold it more effectively if I was to step back into that environment. And this is what I invite you to try too, regardless of what area you're applying this to. I've spoken to people before about how this can apply even if you're going somewhere like a large shopping center, right? Now, there is a small part of my brain that's like, that's ridiculous. You shouldn't feel anything going to a large shopping center. You just get in, get your thing done and leave. But the reality is large shopping centers can be very overwhelming. I went through a period where I would notice that every time I walked into an environment like that, I would get a really mixed up, upset stomach and be like, oh, I got to get out of here. I've got to leave. And it took me a while to put two and two together that it was just a bombardment on my nervous system that, again, I hadn't appropriately scaffolded to be able to navigate that space with more ease. So, how do we scaffold? This is the important question. And there's three things I think that I've written down that I want to offer up today that hopefully feels fairly simple, but also things that you can kind of chew over for a while, because even, however many years I am into knowing that I'm a highly sensitive person and what that means, I think I still refine this every day, to be honest. I still learn things and go, oh, that's somewhere that I could be kinder or more compassionate or find more capacity for scaffolding. Because I don't want to be constantly running from my own overwhelm. I want to be like meeting it with the support that it needs so that I can navigate life feeling like I'm more in a place of agency and choice. That's what I most deeply desire. So the first thing is that when it comes to scaffolding your sensitivity, you want to be able to do that both proactively and responsively. So an example of that is knowing what practices, what activities, what tools help you to feel more regulated more often. So for example, I know that sitting in meditation is one of those tools for me, regular mindful movement is one of those, and walking. They're probably top three. And so if I do those things regularly as a matter of course, I'm more likely to feel more regulated more of the time. And then there's those situations where you find yourself maybe in the big supermarket, maybe in the large shopping mall, maybe in a busy kind of social gathering environment, and you start to notice, oh, my nervous system, my sensitivity is like pinging all over the place, and I want to do something about that because it feels overwhelming. And that's where we have the opportunity to be responsive in our scaffolding, responsive in our checking in on, what might I need now? And that's where we can access a million different tools. So I don't want to go into an endless list here, but that's where we use our grounding practices. That's where we can use things like breathing practices and self-talk to be able to say, I'm having a moment here of overwhelm, sensory overload, whatever it might be. And here is how I'm going to meet that with a sense of respect for the fact that my nervous system and I are sensitive. Because if I try to ignore that, it is not going to help. If I try to pretend that that's not true, it is not going to help. If I try to punish that part of me, it is not going to help. And so how instead can I move from this place of self-respect, respect for my sensitivity, and scaffold myself appropriately? The other thing is, in order to do that, you have to be able to read your state, right? You have to be able to understand what it is you're feeling and what that might translate to. So for example, that example that I just gave you about, being in a shopping center, or this often happens, my youngest son and I, we really like to go to op shops, and we really like to go to what are they called? Market fairs, where people hire different stalls and there might be handmade things and vintage things and all sorts of things. And almost without fail, when I step into one of those places, despite the fact that I adore them, I feel sick. I get a mixed up, upset stomach. And it took me quite a while to recognize, my nervous system is having a response to this environment. Not because I don't like it here, but because sensory-wise, it's actually quite demanding. There's a lot going on. And now that I realize that, it doesn't happen as often because I, again, am able to scaffold myself. And part of the way that I might do that is to say, okay, we're only going to stay for half an hour. So there's this kind of preempting, I guess, of my nervous system response to say, I know this is a lot, but we're only going to be here for half an hour. And I actually love coming. Like, I actually love being here and looking at this stuff. So, but if we don't know what's going on, if we're not curious about the reactions and the responses and the symptoms and feelings that our body and our nervous system show up, then we don't have the opportunity to meet them in that way, to meet them with curiosity and compassion, because we don't know what's going on. We might either not sense them at all, or we might shame them, or we might ignore them, or we might panic, right? Any of those things might be possible. And so really getting to know your nervous system is key. And the third one I've sort of already talked about, but haven't named, and that is moving from a foundation that you choose to be self-respectful and self-compassionate. That makes a world of difference, because instead of kind of having this shaky foundation of shame and self-blame and punishment around your sensitivity, you have this foundation of, I'm going to respect my sensitivity as it is. I'm going to respect my sensitivity when it shows up, which is always, but when it makes a bit of noise, when it's overwhelmed. Because you can actually desensitize a little bit to be in environments and in places and in spaces that you want to be, that you choose to be, without your nervous system firing off like a million warning signals. That is possible. But the best way to do that is not by ignoring it, but scaffolding it. And so if we start from this foundation of, I have deep respect for the way that my body, my brain, my nervous system works, then we actually open up far more opportunity for ourselves than if we are ignoring or blaming or shaming our sensitivity. And that is really key. So yeah, I think that's kind of all I wanted to cover today. Kind of a short one back to get back into the game of podcasting. But thank you again for being here. I'm going to just quickly go over those 3 points again, but being both proactive and responsive in the way that you scaffold your sensitivity, learning to read your nervous system, and starting from a foundation and a basis of self-respect and compassion. I realize that those 3 tips are kind of just scratching the surface of like, okay, but how? And so I want to, if I've got some other resources to pop into the show notes, which I haven't pre-prepared in my notes, I will certainly pop some things in there, maybe some previous episodes that will be helpful. But that's also the work that I do with people in all of the various spaces that I work in. So if you want to inquire about working with me, either one-on-one or in my group, membership program, then you can reach out to me for that as well, and I'll pop some details in the show notes, because this stuff takes time, right? It does take time. It takes a desire to really work through it. And that is the kind of work that I love to do with people, but hopefully that gives you enough food for thought to either go out and explore that on your own, or to reach out for support if I can help you. I do actually have some spaces at the moment for one-on-one counselling clients, and so if you are looking for that kind of one-on-one level support, then please do reach out. There are spaces to start straight away. And yeah, I would love to hear from you. I love to hear how you scaffold your own sensitivity. And if you've got stories about when that's been hard, I'm really open to hearing those from you, and you know how you've managed that, because I'm sure there are as many ways to navigate these things as there are individuals navigating them. So yeah, don't be a stranger. I would love to hear from you. All right, until next week, thank you for joining me. Keep being kind to yourselves, and I will talk to you soon.